I'm Ali Bounds, and I'm a new partner principal at BVN. So I was made a partner about a year and a half ago now, and I tend to focus more on educational projects lately. The last couple of years I've been particularly focused on that and very passionate about the education projects, schools, some pretty challenging schools, and some interesting learning curves, particularly with Arthur Phillip. I think that was a real kind of change in the type of understanding type of teaching, and sort of inspired me to focus on that a bit more over the last few years.
And I'm Bill Dowzer, and I've been a principal for a little bit longer than Ali, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But my period of time within the practice has actually been very varied, from working on workplace projects, on sort of big urban projects, and then more recently helping set up the office in New York, which we have for the last 5 years. And my real passion has been around the idea of, kit of parts, about scalability, about how we can take the sort of the knowledge and that we have as architects on bespoke projects and look at how you can put that into different environments.
Fantastic. And right now there is a big opportunity around some of those things you were speaking about there, Bill, with the New South Wales stimulus in education and school projects. Can you tell us a little bit about what these projects are and what kind of design goals they're looking to implement for these new schools?
I think that's a good one for you.
Okay, there's obviously a huge kind of demand for schools at the moment, and increased population, lack of schools, particularly all around Sydney, and in the outer suburbs. We're seeing kind of the replacement of a lot of demountable schools with more permanent infrastructure. We're also seeing a lot of the private school sector or the independent school sector sort of trying to keep up with that demand from schools infrastructure, as well as the kit of parts, DfMA work that schools infrastructure has been doing is also heavily influencing the independent schools. And we're working with a lot of them to kind of look at the synergies between both the independent and schools infrastructure work that's going on. So it's a really kind of exciting time in schools, because there's a lot of competition between them, and there's a lot of need for new and interesting schools to address that demand.
And what are some of so I understand they're using the kit of parts design approach. Why would you go down that path, and what are some of the teething challenges in adopting this in construction?
So there's a number of scales or levels of kit of parts, and I guess some of the experience that we had earlier around, particularly at Arthur Phillip, was testing some ideas of kit of parts elements. So from furniture, meeting room settings, through to the structure itself, the general structure of the building being modular, flexible. So there's a whole kind of range of what kit of part means and benefits from it, from the small scale to the large scale. Schools infrastructure have obviously been looking at the DfMA, Design for Mass Assembly, as a way of kind of addressing the large scale, looking at volumetric elements that you can put in place really easily, bring to site really easily. That's the structure of the building, but also down to the smaller elements within the building, the joinery modules, the meeting rooms. And we've been doing a lot of that work in workplace over the years, and that has heavily influenced education projects. There's teething issues with that because it's not necessarily the norm at the moment, and so there's a sort of supply chain pressure on it. And we're looking at ways in which we can actually bring our learning from the cross-sector experience, the workplace stuff that we've done, and look at how we can make that teething process a little easier. We are doing that on independent schools already. So I guess MLC was a good example of a building that was essentially just a very regular concrete frame building inspired by a workplace kind of style commercial building that allowed them to future-proof pedagogical change and the change in the way that you're teaching. You can just strip that out. Ultimately, they could strip that building out and completely refit it in a different arrangement, because all the elements within it are kit of parts essentially. At the moment, that kit of parts approach doesn't allow you to necessarily deliver it more cost effectively. But I guess the hope is that down the line, as this becomes more the norm, that it will actually be more cost effective, and people like schools infrastructure, by actually providing this guideline and implementing it as something that's sort of a strategy holistically, hopefully will actually make that more cost effective and simpler for people to do.
And I think in terms of costs, I mean, one of the things is actually about getting cost certainty. And I think that is the thing that sort of comes through more with a design for manufacture approach, which is that, you know how much the element is going to cost. Where it becomes specific is actually when you're citing these elements. So I think that's something that, there's not, cost certainty is the sort of thing that eludes most architectural projects because of all of the different conditions. And I think that the sort of the approach of a design for manufacture way of being is really all around that sort of the idea that you actually can get high quality at a reasonable cost and then keep the cost certainty.
I think you also need to make sure that one of the challenges that comes up and people often dispute with the design for manufacture or the modular elements is that kind of the joy of the buildings, and still bringing in something that's unique to that school. And I think that's where we really enjoy that sort of synergy of those two things, making sure there's flexibility, making sure that the design actually reflects the need for change, because it's inevitable, and that means it's a sustainable kind of response to schools, but that it also is site specific. And so not everything can be modular, not everything can be the same, because every site is different, and you need to bring something that's appropriate for each school as well. It has a character in that community, and make sure that that's addressed to actually bring joy to a school, because it also needs to be age appropriate. I think is very important. It's not any other building, it's for kids.
And how do you, just to drill down a little bit on that, how do you maintain some of that flexibility for being a site specific, but also having, one critique people might have of what they don't want, or a dystopian nightmare is everything just looks the same or something. So how do you maintain this flexibility and site specific and be adaptive as well?
I think with the schools, particularly with the schools infrastructure stuff that's being explored at the moment, it's making sure that the community uses, the shared use spaces, which always have to be somewhat more site specific, are delivered in a way that gives them a character that they can identify with and something that they can feel proud of, and that the general teaching spaces are the spaces that are a bit more flexible. And flexibility doesn't necessarily mean that everything's the same. It just means that you can change it easily, that I think you need to actually have variety to be flexible. So you need to provide lots of different types of spaces to actually be flexible. It doesn't mean that everything is the same. It means that there are places to go for different functions. And that's one of the ways that we look to deliver that within the kind of public schools. With the independent schools, there's obviously often a bit more there in the cost initially, or aspiration, that allows you that kind of opportunity. And I think with that, we're pushing pretty hard the biophilic, or the responses you get from using natural elements like cross-laminated timber, which often the budgets don't allow for that in the public school sector as much. So we're trying to drive that more, to sort of learn from the building and make the building something that allows the students to understand the world around them a bit more.
So what aspects of the kit of parts allow it to be suitable for timber to get some of these advantages of biophilia and sustainability?
Well, the guidelines at the moment are set up based around a structural grid that has been set up and designed to allow you the flexibility to do it, either steel, either concrete, or timber. So it's been tested to work for all of them, with the ultimate goal being that hopefully you'd be able to do them out of CLT as much as possible. If that suits the site, if that suits the environment, if it's available. There are issues at the moment with procurement of timber, because it hasn't been around as much. And so suddenly, if you've got a big client like schools infrastructure, building all their schools out of it. It will put pressure on that industry and hopefully then build that industry up to be a bit more of the norm. But the grid has been designed to allow that, and there's been a lot of consideration into the detailing of that guideline around actually experiencing it as well. So you're not cladding the timber; it's something that you will see, and that's really important because that's one of the main benefits is actually being able to expose the timber structure, because the timber itself, there's a lot of research that's gone into the benefits of that for students and just being around natural elements. So there's a sustainability story from the fact that the material is has a low carbon impact, but also that it actually just makes you feel better to be around it. So that's been built into the guidelines, and the work that we're doing has been testing similar. We do use other grid sizes, but we don't usually depart much from that, because we often find with our clients as well, you need to build in that flexibility through the detail design and construction phases to allow the clients to substitute that for a different material if they really need to. So it benefits to actually have something that's flexible from that perspective.
I think one of the other things that's kind of interesting too at the moment, mainly the timber for buildings, for CLT buildings, is mainly come from Europe. So I think that's the big change, is as local production happens, and as we move forward with more demand, then that will start to change some of the costing equations that are happening with the products at the moment. But it's definitely the way we're moving. But the industry is taking some time to get there.
And you think, Bill, like with the standardized design and suppliers understanding exactly what sizes are coming through, then it happens both ways. It's easier to design, but it's probably easier for suppliers to be delivering when they know exactly what they need to put into their manufacturing processes.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's something we've learned from small scale as well. Is that when you're working on this, and we did this a lot in the sort of North American market, where we did a lot of interiors as the kit of parts, and that actually there's far more certainty there than there has been sort of necessarily within the sort of mass building elements.
I think that at the moment there aren't that many suppliers of CLT, for instance, and so as Bill said, a lot of it comes from Europe. But you end up in a situation where, because there's only a few specific suppliers, the structure kind of gets redesigned. So you design it once, you design it again once they choose someone who's actually the selected supplier of that timber, and it makes the process very inefficient. So I guess by having those grids set out, as you say, it does actually minimise the impact of that. Everybody's got some predictability in what they're designing to, and hopefully makes it more cost effective, and that there's less wastage, and that you're minimising kind of issues with services in and things like that on site. So it streamlines the process. And one of the other things we found with actually using it, I think ANU was one of our biggest sort of first projects where we used a lot of the CLT and the glulam timber, the glulam beams and columns, was it reduced significantly the amount of people on site. So there was a ridiculously low number of people actually in the assembly of that building, which saves money, but also very, very time effective. So that building went up super fast. And all of that is a good story for schools where you've got issues, particularly got lots of issues on site when you're actually assembling a new building and trying to minimise the number of people there and the length of time that they're there. There's a lot of benefits from that perspective as well with CLT, to just be able to have 8 people come in and assemble a building on a tight school site where you've got kids is really beneficial for schools in terms of the story.
Yeah, you've mentioned a few really interesting things so far about where the savings could be. Do you have any idea of what the numbers are in terms of overall cost savings with kit of parts, and then also in what areas in the design or construction where those efficiencies actually come from?
Well, I guess the efficiencies, there are definite efficiencies in the time on site and construction of if you use CLT. we know that from experience of delivering a number of these projects now. There are efficiencies in terms of the materials that you use as well, in terms of the systems. If you're clever about the system, the one we used at OLA was actually a sort of lignotron ceiling system. So all the services are integrated within it, and the timber structure actually has the zone for the services within it. So there's efficiencies in terms of material there, and I think, but it's quite hard to quantify at the moment, and it's actually something we struggle with a lot with quantity surveyors. So at the front end of projects, kind of justifying that CLT is going to actually be the same cost or more cost effective throughout the life of the design of the project and the construction of the project is quite hard for us to quantify. QSs at the moment aren't familiar with it, and so generally tend to whack a price on it for the fact that it's an international material, that there's some unpredictability about it, and the supply chain particularly. So we get this sort of conservative premium put on it, and that often ends up steering clients down a path of something that they know, and so they end up choosing concrete or steel less so these days, because there's issues with intumescent, and as fire becomes more of an issue. And I think that's another thing, actually, people have been very cautious about fire, the whole thing about wood and fire. It's taken them a little while to kind of get the charring rates and start to understand that side of timber as well. So it's actually quite hard to quantify, I think, is the answer.
And I think that really goes to the idea, that it really goes to the notion that it needs clients who will be prepared to take a leap of faith at this stage. Because it's the right thing to do environmentally. We are moving to a scalable approach, but we're still in the sort of earlier days of development.
And it sounds like a bit of a chicken and egg. Like you need the quantity surveyor to have projects under the belt to be able to accurately quantify it, but because it's not there, you don't get the projects under the belt to for them to get that certainty in cost.
Yeah. That's actually with all subconsultants. what you just said, in a way, what you just identified is actually the issue. When we're considering working or designing a CLT building, we're looking for people who've had experience in all of the disciplines.
Because it's a bit of a steep learning curve, and you don't want, we've embarked on a number of projects now where you start with that aspiration, and the whole project team is kind of learning through the design process. And so you get to a point where you've got a team that understand the constraints of this material and the possibilities and opportunities for it as well. And then you get a whole new consultant team, and you're learning again. So but we are delivering one at the moment that's just going to tender, and it's a hybrid. It's actually a hybrid of kind of composite. It's got concrete slabs and glulam beams and columns, so it's gone down a path that isn't quite as purist, but they are definitely, the client thinks that it's actually going to save them money in the end, because there's all sorts of procurement issues with steel, and now post-COVID we're seeing the supply of other things coming from Asia is pretty tricky as well. So there's a bit of a premium on concrete and other building materials too. So it's sort of, they think that the timber move is actually something that's saved them time and money as well. So hopefully we'll see a bit more of that happening. It gives us a little bit more to actually demonstrate the theory.
I think there is a growing awareness that concrete is it actually takes a lot of energy, and it's particularly detrimental to the environment in terms of the types of cement that gets used. There are changes in terms of green cements coming, so that's changing the products. But I think that it's interesting is that the demand is coming from the end users who are asking for an environmental response and an idea of longevity of the building, and sort of a custodianship, in a way. Environmental custodianship is actually being driven by the end user.
I think there's quite a big focus at the moment we're seeing with some of the clients this year as well, that following COVID, the wellness kind of story, particularly with students and our kids, is pretty significant, and there's a very significant kind of focus on that from the schools. So it's a very good time to actually talk to the benefits of the biophilic buildings, and the benefits of the building actually providing the best possible environment for our kids to be in. And I think they're acknowledging, the school clients are acknowledging that a lot more than perhaps that they might have in the past. So I think it's a good opportunity for that to continue to kind of get them across the line.
We've been talking a lot about the benefits of timber and the reasons for adopting it. Is there any other sustainability or biophilic features that you think must-haves, or you highly recommend for school projects to help kids with their learning and their well-being, but also the sustainability for the kids' future on the planet?
So we talk a lot about learning from the building as teacher, and I guess we see that in a lot of other buildings. Doesn't have to just be schools, but the kind of benefit of actually seeing all the services, and if you design it in a nice way, I think that they can be quite beautiful and be something that educates the students. We're also integrating things like PV cells within the facade, and there's a lot more data that can be collected from the building as well that can then be demonstrated within the building. So often we're kind of, there was one building we did where we were putting PVs on different elevations of the facade, and then that was actually translated into data that could be read on screens within the space, so that the students could literally understand when the sun was moving around the building how much power that was making for the building. They can see it on their facade, and that's then generated into information that's legible. I think we also sort of promote the circulation and the idea of community in a building. So making sure that you're actually putting the community at the heart, or somewhere that's actually got a sort of legible centre. So seeing people move up and down the building, promoting actually walking through the building. It's one of the challenges that we have with the vertical schools that we're looking at, incorporating that circulation in a way that makes the building actually function well without having to rely on lifts and other elements. So yeah.
It's actually really all about where the positioning of the stairs too. So the stairs are easy to use and in sort of well located, rather than necessarily going to the lifts. So what we try and do is look for using the stairs as a sort of quicker way of going between floors than a sort of mechanical transport.
And a way of creating community. I think the other thing with schools is once they get really big, you need to actually concentrate on the student community. The sense of a community is kind of hard to create when you get beyond 200 students or so within a cluster. So we tend to design our buildings around this kind of community clusters, and circulation points are often the kind of focus of that, to get bump and get interaction and collaboration, and teach the students about all the things that they're going to actually experience in a workplace. And it's a real focus that you actually have spaces that create a community and don't feel just huge and disjointed. So I think that's a very important, it's got a sustainable layer, but it's also an education and just a wellness sort of aspect of school buildings, I think.
It actually becomes a socially sustainable way too. And I think that we've really been sort of working in workplace projects probably for the last 20 years as a practice. And I think that's where a lot of this work was pioneered. There's a lot of work around, what's the right size neighbourhood for a grouping, what's the right, what are those sort of comfortable things. The interesting thing for us too is that probably about 6 years ago, we started taking educators into the new workplaces that we designed, and many of them turned around and said they could be schools. So it's been interesting in the sorts of work that we do, which is what we talk about translational design, which is taking sort of ideas from one sector to another, has actually really flourished in the union between workplace and school.
And I think the other one is libraries, the public spaces.
Yes.
So those sort of other places that you learn, learning from those, and the things that have been successful in those, you now see appearing in lots of school buildings as well. So there's a real blurring of the boundaries between what used to just look like a school, and if we look at our library projects, our workplace projects, there's a lot that you can a lot of similarities you can see.
And I think a lot of that's to do with empowering the user. And I think to make choices, and that means in a learning environment, allowing the teachers to be able to reconfigure and for the way they want to teach, because we're not talking about traditional classrooms where a chalkboard at the front and then rows of desks. We're actually really talking about an enabled space that works for different learning styles for different people.
Yeah, and you don't want to end up in a situation where you're actually forcing teachers to teach co-teaching if they're not comfortable with it. You need the flexibility that there are the options, I guess, is always the.
Yeah, fantastic. And do you, as we're approaching towards the end now, my final question is just around, there's some changes going on with offsite and kit of parts like we've been talking about. Do you think the role of the architect is transforming a little bit as we're moving forward at all?
I would say yes, at the level of well, I was educated in a world which was about the bespoke. In terms of you designed everything was different for the application for the place. I think that understanding the problems that we're solving for the world. The problems, that sounded a little bit too highfalutin. The problems that we're now being asked to solve really have to be scalable. So I think one of the things for us, in a way, when you're working with a kit of parts, is the idea of creating a chassis. So let's say there's 80% is commonality between different sites. And then one of the things is actually being able to then overlay the layering that actually makes it bespoke to that site. And that sort of means that you don't get the sort of cookie cutter approach, and you don't get the sort of exact same in all locations. But what's underneath the framework and the thinking, you don't have to keep replicating that. You don't have to keep redoing that.
Makes absolute sense. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Bill and Ali. If people want to find out more about yourselves or BVN, or if there's anything you want to leave us with or plug anything, where should they go? we can just start. If there's not, we can just don't have to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all of our projects are on our website, and which is bvn.com.au.
Yeah.
But also another
LinkedIn
thing,
and Instagram as well, if you.
And another thing that we have pioneered that's worth looking at as a kit of parts too, which was part of what we did in New York recently, is Reply, which is re-ply.org, where we basically took plywood that was used to board up the shops in New York after the race riots, and turn it into outdoor furniture using a design for manufacture approach for restaurants to be able to reopen. And that's been that's been a really fast moving startup that we did, but it's actually, we've learned so much out of that. And it actually is all based on our sort of previous knowledge of kit of parts and how we do things. So it's,
it's kind of a little micro version of our kind of kit of parts thinking.
Yeah. I love it. Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure to meet you both. And I really enjoyed that. And I'm sure the listeners did too.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.